a month. And so, how were they doing? Well, let's look at Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy from Pride and Prejudice, the love interest of a lot of people in Pride and Prejudice, was bringing home 10,000 pounds a year. Now, it's very difficult to translate cash values in the Regency period when Jane Austen's novels are set with our values, because we have a cash economy, and cash was only a part of their economy. They had much more a goods and barter economy than we do. But 10,000 pounds a year, that's way over $1 million. That's his annual income. He was worth something over $20 million in our terms. Mr. Darcy, a good catch. So, Mr. Bennet, the sarcastic father of Elizabeth Bennet with the fine eyes and the beautiful figure, he's bringing in how much? 2,000 pounds a year. He's not doing bad, but he has 5 daughters, and his property, and this is part of the reason cash values don't equate, his property cannot go to any of his daughters. It's going to another guy who is not very generous. And so, but they're doing all right. Now, Mrs. Dashwood, in Sense and Sensibility, she has 3 daughters. None of them are married, and she's living on 500 pounds a year in kind of reduced circumstances, because she also has a stingy relative who won't help her out. And so a mining engineer in Cornwall, which would be someone actually running the engines, someone acquainted with the steam engines, running underground railroads, someone directing the work in the mine rather than doing it, probably making 100 pounds a year. A tribute miner, 50 pounds a year, and a tut worker, 40 pounds a year. So you get a sense, the workers, they were poor. And the work was long, and it was hard, and it took a lot of stamina. And so, but they were able to set their own wages within limits, and if they had a son working, or a daughter is a ball maiden, or the wife goes back to the wheel to pound rocks, you can get that income up. William Wordsworth, just for reference, the great poet, well, his great work came out in 1798, Lyrical Ballads. He was also living in a rural area with his sister Dorothy on 35 pounds a year. So he was really just scraping by, and they were buying books too. But so it gives you an idea of the relative values. So we talk about this in the Cornish class. We develop it more thoroughly, but there's the 4 M's of Cornish culture. Mining, we talked about. Methodism, we talked about. Migration is sort of the fulfillment of the others. And migration, in a lot of ways, becomes the fulfillment of Cornish culture. And then they took their music with them. And so the common story is, well, the Cornish, this is a false story. I'm setting up, this is a straw dog, everybody. The Cornish, kind of like the Irish, there was a potato famine, and then they all had to go. And the Cornish, well, the copper mines failed because they were cheaper resources, cheaper deposit of copper opened up around the Great Lakes and in Chile and in Malaysia and other places. And so the Cornish had to go. Well, not really. The Cornish were already gone because the Cornish started going as soon as the British whipped Napoleon and opened the first great era of globalization, and the Cornish were off with the shot, and so they went where the British capital went. They went where the money men in London were sending their money, and they took their technology with them. And so there was this building. And so it developed. By the time the copper mines failed, it's what Philip Hayton called a rage for migration. And it took a third of the population. And not just a third, but the youngest, brightest, enterprising people with the best years of their lives. And so, well, just in time for the California gold rush, here they come. And so in 1849, they came from Cornwall, to be sure. They came from Chile. That was a pretty quick trip in those days. 700 people came to the California gold rush from one town in the Midwest, Mineral Point, Wisconsin. So they came in big numbers from the Midwest. George Sanford has pointed out to me recently, they came from mining operations, gold operations in Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia, and came out to where the real big mines would be developed in California. And so by 1861, the Grass Valley National, which none of us are subscribing to today, we all moved over to the Union, but a woman here from Cornwall, a young woman, was sending reports back to the Cornish newspapers, and she said 60% of the population was Cornish. That's 1890. 1861, the National reported that most of our mining work is being done by Cornishmen. And then by 1911, when Mr. Kenyon came to become editor of the Grass Valley Union, he said, "I have entered a foreign country." 75% of the people here are Cornish or their descendants. And so it was an industrialized workforce that had been developed by the circumstances of the geology and the technology and the economics and the contract system of wages. They had been developed to become these industrial workers. They were all ready for the Industrial Revolution in America, already disciplined to it. I worked in an industrial plant all of my working life. And Dave Comstock was with us last night, and he shook his head in dismay and said, "I never could have done that." And I said, "Well, it was easy for me. I was trained by my Cornish ancestors. I was already a tool of the Industrial Revolution." And so Arrow McBoyle, when he was developing the Idaho, Maryland mine and didn't have any capital to work with, turned to tribute miners. And so he wrote this to his stockholders, the people that he was trying to draw more money out of. All the mines of the Grass Valley District, including the Empire, have been saved at one time or another by tributors finding new ore bodies after the mines were abandoned by eminent engineers as worked out. Eminent engineers, if you've read McBoyle's Gold, you know in Mr. McBoyle's vernacular, that is not a compliment. And so, just to give you some examples of how what tributors did, well, in Cornwall, like in Ross Poldark's operation, Ross has always got kind of a marginal mine. that he's working. And so tribute miners are ideal for that because they are in effect bringing a kind of capital. They're bringing labor so that Ross doesn't have to go out and raise money. The same thing happened here. A lot of marginal properties that would not have been working or would not have continued got worked because they turned to the tribute system. In about 1892, the empire wasn't paying very well. What do you know? William Bourne had sold out just before that. That clever man. And left his cousin George Starr there trying to make it pay. And they took George Starr persuaded 60 men to leave the payroll and take tribute pitches. And that kept the mighty empire going. Arrow McBoyle got tribute miners in the Idaho, Maryland, and made that in the 1930s the richest gold mine in California, second richest gold mine in America, just in time to employ 1,000 men. When George Starr came back, these are a little random, I'm sorry, in 1898 from Africa, and famously asked his cousin for $250,000. William Bourne didn't take it well, by the way. He brought in tribute miners right away, had these guys working tribute. The work your own digging mines, the YWOD, help me. Thank you. A tribute operation. I mean, that's just a bunch of pars working a mine. And every mine in these two districts, Nevada City, Grass Valley, plus the outlying districts, Rough and Ready, and Brownsville, and so forth, all tribute miners kept that going. So it was this Cornish legacy that all the things that we mentioned when I asked you what come to mind with Cornish miners, all of that stuff that you said, plus this legacy, this sense that they were the equal of the men employing them and that they were partners in the mine. And that's what made these mines go. So here's a story about the Cornish miner. When they're working underground and the boss would come around, they would set down their tools. Cornish miners did not work in front of the boss. They would stand there and talk to him, you know? How about those miners? And then when the boss would leave, they would go back to work because they were motivated to work. And so that's part of the legacy. So this sense of being entrepreneurs, of being owners, of themselves being adventurers, that's really what made the Cornish miner and what made him different and stand out. Now, just to show you, just to prove, oh, here's a song, "Where is My Wandering Boy Tonight?" sung by many a lonely mother back in Cornwall, wondering where her boy had gone to, lost in America. And so the Cornish brought the pasties, saffron cake, a lot of teas. A lot of tea has been drunk in these two towns. Of course, our Cornish Carol Choir, been singing since 1876, went on the national radio and international radio on the BBC and Armed Forces networks many times during the war period especially. That's all part of it. But this work ethic, their knowledge as miners, and this tribute system, everybody got in on. So, and I want Jerry to hear this, the Italian miners became terrific tribute miners. And the Irish miners who had always been the enemy of the Cornish, things were kind of patched up in Grass Valley because so many Cornish guys married Irish girls, including my great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather. And, but the Irish got in on it. So what the tribute system became here is maybe a little different than in Cornwall, because it was always a contract that they could create the contract to the terms that suit themselves. But here especially, there is often a combining of tut work and tribute work. So the most successful team that Mr. McBoyle employed in the Idaho, Maryland, was led by Mike McGuire, a good Irishman, and a pillar of St. Patrick's Church. And the terms were that they had to do a certain amount of tut work. They had to do so much excavating, plus they had to lay track and run electrical line. And for this, they then got a percentage of the gold. And Mike McGuire's team made the first big strike that began the recovery of the Idaho, Maryland mine in 1926. And I can't tell you how much they made, but they all had new automobiles. Every member of his team had a new automobile. And there were, I believe Mr. McBoyle was running about 7 tribute teams, especially from about 1926 to 1933. And they all did very well. Matter of fact, one of his investors said to him, "Mac, you got to stop this. You're running these guys, you're running this mine on a 50-50 basis with these miners." And so that's how successful they were. So how tut work and tribute work actually played in this county as late as the 1930s is described very well in a book, in a chapter called The Tributers in the book McBoyle's Gold. And then Orlo Steele recently had me drive, and we went out to the Rowe Shaft at the Empire Mine, which was not quite sure what the signage represents. I'm sure the dates on the sign are very important, but the date it was actually sunk was 1941. And the Rowe Shaft was always operated with tributers. And it was fairly rich ore. This may have just had to do with management and supervising these guys. They were a little bit off on their own, and it may have just been the convenient thing to do. But when Orlo was working in the mine in 1950 and subsequent to that, the Rowe Shaft was a tribute miner's shaft, and named for Bill Rowe, whose grandson-in-law Bob is in the front row. So that's what the Cornish miner brought here, as well as pasties and tea treats at the Methodist Church. And then there was this other element which we didn't talk about at all in the Cornish class, but well, next time I think we will, and that is the Cornish sense of humor. And so the one of the engineers at the mine for Newmont, Bill Heimer, and his first name? Lee Billheimer, thank you, was asked when he was interviewed by the Empire Mine Park Association, what was the best thing about working here? And you know, he said the usual thing, you know, I learned a lot, you know, the climate was good, was working for good men and so forth. And then he added, the humor, the Cornish sense of humor really adds something to these mines. And so there were these Cornish stories, and everybody used to tell them. The miners told them at all the mines where the Cornish had gone to, these Cornish Cousin Jack stories, they call them, and they circulated around. They went back to Cornwall. By 1840, Cousin Jack stories were a rage in Cornwall. Everybody was telling Cousin Jack stories. And, but not just the workers. Libby Starr, when she would have her elegant teas and card parties up at the mine and at their fabulous house there, she would have her guests in stitches telling them Cousin Jack stories, dropping H's where H's should have been and adding H's where H's should not have been, and so forth. Of course, Mary Halleck Foote used the Cornish dialect very much in her stories to really great effect. And James Haig, the owner of the North Star mine, he could break into a Cornish brogue and tell stories because he was very good at jollying along the money men in San Francisco and New York, and anything that got them laughing was probably a good thing for financing the mine. And so I can't do the dialect. There's books of cartoons done by a man named Oswald Pryor in South Australia, which was a huge Cornish settlement down there, comparable to Grass Valley, Nevada City. And let's see, one of them is, there's often the mine captain or the mine superintendent. In South Australia, it was Captain Ancock. Captain Ancock is up there in that cartoon saying, "When I say something tis, it tis, even when it tisn't." And I don't know how well you can see the drawings, but I can tell you the background, it's all mines. So here's a cartoon, a little Cornishman. And most of them were like Rita's dad. They weren't that big.
They were built for a low stove.
They were built for a low stove. See, we're getting back to the biological. But they often weren't very big. And so here's a little Cornishman. The mine captain has got a pretty good boiler going. And there's a couple of husky Cornishmen in the background. And the mine captain is saying to this little guy, "Well, if I take you on, you'll have to pull your weight." And then here's a picture of a Cornish choir singing underground with candles on top of their helmets, which I can assure you never happened except in 1941 and 42 when the choir sang underground for the NBC radio network. And so here's the cover, one of Mr. Pryor's books, and the Cornishman, he's in his clothes there, he's kind of ducking his head the back door of the Methodist chapel, and in a stage whisper he's asking someone, he's saying, "Ask the missus what time I should put the pasties on." And then one of my favorites, oh, this is something else. Here's a Cornishman, so you got all the Cornish emblems. You got a member of the Masonic Lodge. The Cornish were great lodge joiners, and Madison Lodge in Grass Valley would hardly have had a quorum without all the Cornishmen they had. And here's another Cornishman who's it says, "Did you have a good time home to Cornwall?" And the well-dressed man said, "I had a marvelous time. I sang at 4 funerals." And my personal favorite is the Cornishman who is interviewing for a job. And he's standing there on the step, the mine captain. The mine captain says, "Have you got any experience with explosives?" And Cousin Jack says, "Experience? I've been blown to bits 3 times." So anyway, they go on and on and on. And so to end on something that, well, is really no joke, we've got our local heritage site, just one of many, but that stamp mill, little 4 stamp mill, at the corner of Main and Auburn Street, right next to City Hall. You may not know that, but that stamp mill is dedicated to the Cousin Jacks. And so we have our own site. Now, in Cornwall, which they had to share with West Devon, they have a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. So they have been designated this World Heritage Site. Took them a lot of work, many years to get that. I gave them a little help from California, and they're very proud of it. It draws a lot of tourists. The UN gave it to them to draw tourism, to help your economy. When the UN is giving you plaques to draw tourists, you're in economic trouble. And so Cornwall is one of the poorest areas of the European Union. We can still say that until March 29th. And of course, the reason was all this investment came out from mining in the 1700s and 1800s especially, and the profits went back to the City of London for the most part. And other elements of the economy were never developed. So fortunately, Nevada County had timber to fall back on and some other resources, and but Cornwall had only tourism. And so having economy based upon one industry is never a good recipe. And so that's why Cousin Jack came, and that's why he's still here, because we're living large in the USA, and had that great work ethic and that valuing of education that John Wesley gave us. And so some of us got some book learning, and America has worked out great for us. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate you coming.